scolding like it's just, we don't, we have a lot of lawyers here, so we want to make sure. Mike, how'd I do? All right, next up, to talk, how many New Jersey residents do we have here, just to make sure? Actually, how many Pennsylvania residents do we have? Okay, we're going to be talking about New Jersey gun law. So up is again, one of my absolute best friends, and the way I met him, of course, is working with him through Law Shield. Mike Giramita is a complete and total fireball, and he's going to tell you the very basics of, when can you, we always talk about using a firearm in defense of ourselves or someone else. When can you actually do it? Mike will tell us. Mike.
All right, how's everybody doing this afternoon? Great. Can you hear me? We good? All right, let's give one more round of applause for Scott Bach. That was excellent. On the forefront for fighting and preserving our Second Amendment. So my name is Mike Giramita. I practice in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. My office is based in Philadelphia. I've got a second office in the Harrisburg area. But I like to tell people that my job is I fight for our Constitution, I fight for our Second Amendment, and I fight for law-abiding gun owners. Which brings me to my next question. How many of us here own a firearm? All right, beautiful. Anybody with us who's thinking about owning a firearm but hasn't done so yet? Any of us? Potential prospective law-abiding gun owners? We'll talk a lot about law-abiding gun owners this afternoon. And I always say that when you come on out to these events, I take the educated guess that if you're with us, that you either are or are thinking about becoming a law-abiding gun owner. I'm going to take the educated guess that nobody with us this afternoon wants to engage in any criminal activity. Is that fair? I'm going to take the guess that you didn't come all the way on out here this afternoon just so you could pay your $10 at the door, listen to me talk about all these gun laws, just so you could go out and do the exact opposite and ignore everything that we talked about. So whenever we come to these events, I take the educated guess that you're here to learn the law, to understand the law, and really most importantly, follow the law. It's excellent to see everybody out here, and it's excellent to see some familiar faces. So a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Brooklyn. And I always tell people that being raised in Brooklyn, I had no idea what a law-abiding gun owner was. There's no such thing as a law-abiding gun owner in Brooklyn. Because of their ridiculous laws out there, only two types of people owned firearms growing up. And that was the NYPD, the police, and unfortunately, who? The criminals, you better believe it. So no concept of the law-abiding gun owner growing up. Now, fast forward a few years, I was offered a scholarship to play college baseball out in Oklahoma. And let me tell you something about Oklahoma. The minute I got out there, I quickly realized we weren't in Brooklyn anymore. It's a lot different out in Oklahoma. There's a heavy presence of civilian firearm ownership, a lot of law-abiding gun owners out there. Guns are a way of life out in Oklahoma. So I've got an uncle who lives up in Kansas, started spending more time with him up there. Went up there one year on Thanksgiving, and every Thanksgiving up in Kansas, they've got this tradition. Every Thanksgiving up in Kansas, after everybody eats their turkey, all the men, all the women, and all the children go outside and they shoot their guns. And that was my first experience around other law-abiding gun owners. First time I was ever around civilians with firearms. And it was a very positive experience because I was just about instantly hooked and my life was never the same. Let me ask, how many of us remember that moment that we got hooked? I know it's a significant part of many people's lives. Sure, plenty of us can relate to that feeling. So when I was finished with my playing career, I decided to stay out in Oklahoma, and I attended the University of Tulsa College of Law. And staying out in Oklahoma, I naturally got more and more involved in the law-abiding gun-owning community. The first thing I did was I went out and I joined the Tulsa Indoor Firearms Range. I became a member of the academy over there. I spent just about every Friday and Saturday evening training over there. Then I went out to the world's largest gun show. It actually takes place in Tulsa every single year, for those of us who didn't know. And I always like to tell folks that the minute I picked up my Springfield XD, it was like love at first sight. Do we have any other Springfield folks with us here this afternoon? All right, so they know exactly what I'm talking about. And I'm not too worried because everybody else is going to see the light someday, am I right? You folks will see it, I promise. I also got my license to carry out in Oklahoma, and that was quite an ordeal. In order to get licensed out in Oklahoma, I had to attend an 8-hour course. I had to take 2 written exams, one on gun law, one on gun safety. Then I had to go out on the range and perform a shooting qualification. Then I had to get photographed, go down to the sheriff's department and get fingerprinted, submit all my information, and after a 90-day investigation, I got my license. So quite an ordeal. Much different in Pennsylvania, as you can imagine, and even more stringent here in New Jersey. So the bottom line is, when I finished with my legal education out in Oklahoma, I felt led to come back to the eastern portion of the United States. My roots are in New York, but I didn't want to move to New York because I didn't want to give up my guns. Right? So I landed out here in Pennsylvania. I've got strong ties to New Jersey. My wife is from Sussex County up there. Her father's very active in the hunting community. Her brother is actually law enforcement. And I feel that it's incredibly important that we come out here, we do these types of events here in New Jersey, because now more than ever, I feel that it's important for us to fight to preserve and advance our Second Amendment. So I want to thank every single one of you for making it on out here today. I love coming out to these events for a few reasons. You know, we do quite a few events all across New Jersey and across Pennsylvania. And I love coming out to these events for a few reasons. The first being that I happen to like talking about guns. Let me ask, how many of us like talking about guns? Who doesn't, right? Who doesn't? I also love talking about the law. This is definitely a passion of mine. But really, most importantly, I love it when I get the opportunity to come on out to be around other law-abiding gun owners and prospective law-abiding gun owners like yourselves. I think it's safe to say that we're a like-minded community and we're a very close-knit community. So I think this is excellent that we're here today. Now, before we dive into the law, the moment you've all been waiting for, I've got a couple of quick but important questions for everybody who's with us. How many of us in this room, God forbid it came down to it, God forbid, would be willing to use a firearm to defend your own life or the life of a loved one? How many of us would be willing to do that, God forbid it came down to it? All right, looks like we're unanimous, and that's beautiful. I think that's beautiful because I think it shows a lot about each and every one of you. First of all, I think it shows that you take some level of responsibility for your own safety. Am I right? I think it also shows that you take some level of responsibility for the safety of your loved ones. And I think we can all agree that responsibility is something that's becoming increasingly rare these days, isn't it, folks? But now more than ever, I am proud to be a law-abiding gun owner. I'm thankful for our Second Amendment, our right to protect ourselves. Because I think we can all recognize that we do live in a world that's changing, right? Folks, this isn't the same world that it used to be. How many of us watch the news from time to time? I know we probably try not to, but we see the kinds of things that are going on out there. We saw what just happened at that airport in Florida. We saw what happened at that nightclub in Orlando. We saw what happened at that hospital in Houston, at that mall in Minnesota. We see the home invasions that are going on all over the place. We saw what happened in San Bernardino. And most recently, I like to remind people of this. All the way out in Harrisburg, really not that far, caught a guy recruiting for ISIS. I want you to think about that. They caught a guy recruiting for ISIS in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So now more than ever, I am thankful for being a law-abiding gun owner. I'm thankful for our Second Amendment rights. But I think that we can also all take a step back and truly recognize that with being willing to use a firearm, with being willing to use that firearm, comes a tremendous responsibility. Am I right? Mm-hmm. There is a tremendous responsibility that comes with being willing to pull that trigger, whether it's to protect your own life or the life of a loved one. And if we're going to be willing to take on that responsibility, willing to pull that trigger, whether it's to protect ourselves or to protect our loved ones, we really need to have a solid understanding and a firm grasp on when deadly force is justified in New Jersey. We need to talk about when New Jersey law justifies the use of deadly force. And the fact of the matter is, just about every time you pull that trigger, every time you shoot at that threat, it's going to be considered deadly force in the eyes of the law. Now, people make the mistake all the time that deadly force has to kill somebody. Deadly force does not necessarily have to kill somebody. It's much broader than that. The way the law defines deadly force, any type of force that's intended to cause or may cause death or serious bodily injury. I want you to think about that. Readily capable of causing death or serious bodily injury. And New Jersey law specifically talks about shooting at another human being. So there doesn't have to be a dead body involved. And it might sound strange to some of us, but taking a .22 and shooting at an attacker's legs can be considered deadly force just the same, no differently than taking the .45 and shooting center mass. So if we're going to be willing to pull that trigger, whether it's to protect ourselves or to protect our loved ones, we really need to have a solid understanding and a firm grasp on when deadly force is justified. Now, folks, I've already thrown that term justified around quite a bit so far. It's not just a television program. What I want to do next is I want to talk a little bit about what a justification is and how your justification functions in the legal process. Now, usually when we hear about defensive gun uses, whether it's on television or through some other form of media, we'll hear about these situations and we associate them with self-defense, don't we? You hear about a defensive shooting, you'll think, well, legally that's self-defense. I want to make a point here. How many of us heard about that defensive shooting that took place in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, just about a week ago? I believe it was last weekend. How many of us heard about that? No? Any of us hear about the defensive shooting that took place over in that home invasion in Northumberland, Pennsylvania? Raise your hand nice and high. Any of us hear about the one that took place at that pharmacy in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania not too long ago? Raise your hand nice and high. How about the one that took place right across the border at that pharmacy in Levittown the week before that? Anybody hear about the one that took place at that pizza place in Bucks County, Pennsylvania? We got one. Let me ask you something. How many of us heard about what happened at that nightclub in Orlando? Raise your hand nice and high. Anybody notice something? Does that make any of us a little upset after what Scott and Evan spoke about? It makes me upset. You want to know why? We have these incidents where good, law-abiding citizens used firearms to defend innocent lives. And the media won't talk about this, but innocent people got to go home to their families that evening. They got to lay their head on that pillow. They had to go about their lives in those home invasions. And nobody will hear about it. Yet you better believe some maniac walks through that door and shoots up the joint. Everybody in this entire country will hear about that. So you better believe it makes me upset. And the main reason it makes me upset is I don't want anybody to believe that the good guy with a gun is just a myth. I don't want anybody to think that nobody ever protects innocent lives with firearms. The mainstream media will have us believe that only catastrophes happen when civilians get their hands on firearms. But the numbers happen to tell an entirely different story. One of the most recent studies showed that there are approximately 2,000 defensive gun uses every day in this country. 2,000 a day. How many of us knew that number? And one of the biggest critics of that study actually came on out. You know what they said? They said, no, 2,000 a day, that's far too many. That's too high. Because it's really more like only 60,000 every year. Folks, only 60,000 every year? You got to be kidding me. That's 59,999 more than we're going to hear about on the news. Isn't that true? So you better believe this makes me upset. It absolutely makes me upset because I don't want anybody to believe that the good guy with the gun is just a myth. This is the kind of thing that happens every single day in our country. Now, I kind of went off on a rant there, so you'll have to forgive me. It happens every once in a while. But when we do hear about these situations, we hear about them and we associate them with self-defense, don't we? We hear about these situations, these defensive gun uses, we associate them with self-defense. But the way you'd raise self-defense in a New Jersey court is by raising your justification. And what your justification is it's really just your legal excuse. I want everybody here to remember that, all right? Your justification is your legal excuse. Because what we're saying when we raise our justification is, yes, I've done something that's generally a crime. But the law recognizes this reason why I did it. All right? So we're saying, yeah, I did something that's typically a crime. I did it on purpose. But there's this legally recognized reason why I did it. Does that make sense to all of us? All right, we are not saying it wasn't me. We are not saying I didn't do it. I like to say we're not using O.J. Simpson's defense here, am I right? We're not, because we're saying, yes, I did it, but the law recognizes this reason why. And it's incredibly important for us to understand how your justification functions as your legal excuse. And I think it's best illustrated through the Theodore Wafer case out in Michigan. Any of us familiar with Theodore Wafer's case? I'll remind everybody of the facts. It might sound familiar from the news. So Theodore Wafer was a guy who lived out in Michigan. One night he was sleeping on his recliner in his living room. Middle of the night, 2 or 3 in the morning, wakes up to this loud, constant pounding at his front door. To put this into perspective, this pounding at his front door is so loud that his neighbors even testified that it woke them up, got them out of bed. They came to come see what was going on. So this is some seriously loud pounding at his front door if it's causing his neighbors concern, isn't it? So what happens? Wafer wakes up out of his dead sleep. He gets up frantic. He runs over to his closet. He grabs his Mossberg. He throws one in the chamber. He gets to his front door, opens up the front door, and immediately fires around through the screen door. Does anybody remember who was on the other side of that screen door?
Sheriff.
It was a young lady who had apparently had car trouble about a mile away. Just as bad, right? A young lady, apparently she had car trouble about a mile away. Now, to be fair, nobody's exactly sure what she was doing there. Nobody's sure why she picked his place of all places, or why she was pounding so loud so constantly. But if anything seems clear, it seems pretty clear that this was not the threat that Wafer was expecting when he got to that front door. Seems pretty clear that this is not what he had anticipated. We're talking about a young lady who was unarmed. Now, when Wafer pulled that trigger, fired that round through the screen door, it just about instantly took her face off. So now she's there dead on his front steps. And realizing what had just happened, realizing that this wasn't the threat he expected it to be, Wafer started to absolutely freak out. He started to freak out. And when the law enforcement officers showed up, the first thing Wafer said to them was, "It was an accident, it was a mistake, I didn't mean to do it." Told them it was an accident, it was a mistake, I didn't mean to do it. Now, we're not going to talk about Michigan law this afternoon. So we're not going to get into whether this was justified or what their castle doctrine protections are over in Michigan. But knowing what we already know about your justification being your legal excuse, what do we think Wafer did the second he said it was an accident, it was a mistake, I didn't mean to do it? What do we think he did, folks? He flushed any justification he may have had straight down the drain. Flushed any justification he may have had straight down the drain. How come? Because it was an accident, it was a mistake, I didn't mean to do it. Can't go very well with, yes, I did something that's generally a crime. I did it on purpose. But there's a legally recognized reason why I did it. Does that make sense to all of us, how those two can't go together very well? Of course. Now, later on at trial, Wafer did try to raise a justification. He did try to bring up a justification in court. It didn't work out very well for him. He was convicted, and now he's serving a minimum of 17 years. Now, folks, if you ask me, I'm not even convinced that what Wafer said was an accurate description of what had happened. I don't think that was an accurate description, because I am not convinced that the act of him pulling the trigger was an accident or a mistake, or that he didn't mean to do that at the time. I'm sure we could all understand that looking back on this thing, knowing what he knows now, knowing that this wasn't the threat he expected it to be, I'm sure he considers the entire ordeal an accident or a mistake. I'm sure this guy wishes the entire thing had never happened. But I am not convinced that the act of him pulling that trigger was an accident or a mistake, or that he didn't mean to do that at the time. So let me ask you folks something. Why in the world would Wafer say something that, number one, flushed any justification he may have had straight down the drain, and number two, probably wasn't even an accurate description of what had happened? Why in the world would somebody say something like that? He had just been involved in a critical incident. He had just been involved in a critical incident. And when you're involved in a critical incident, your body undergoes a tremendous amount of physiological effects. It's really like no other experience in life. You know, our chief law enforcement trainer in Pennsylvania, Corporal Todd Hoover, spent over 2 decades with Pennsylvania State Police. He was involved in 3 critical incidents, 3 shooting incidents on the job. And from what Hoover always tells me, the physiological effects that he experienced after critical incident number 3 were not much better than the physiological effects he experienced after critical incident number 1. Now, are any of us familiar with some of these physiological effects we see after a critical incident, whether it's through your training or even experience? Any of us familiar with some of these? What happens?
I wanted to throw up.
Wanted to throw up. We had a guy who immediately vomited on the scene after a critical incident.
My knees went weak.
Knees went weak.
I had to, after it was all over, I had to sleep for 4 hours.
Had to sleep for 4 hours. And what this all stems from is that we get hit with that chemical dump that they're always talking about. That adrenaline hits us like a ton of bricks, and several things happen as a result. Thank you for sharing. What happens to our vision? Immediately get tunnel vision. Immediately become farsighted. You lose the use of your fine motor skills. You've got no depth perception. Our heart rate goes through the roof. Our blood pressure goes through the roof. We had a guy on the scene who swore to us that he heard rushing water. That was his blood pressure. What happens upstairs? This is incredibly important. You'll have racing thoughts and the inability to recall details about what just happened to you. I want you to seriously think about that. The confusion is such that you can't remember the details about what just happened to you. And like I said, we had a guy who immediately vomited right after his critical incident. So taking all this into account, all these physiological effects, I think it's safe to say that right after a critical incident is not the time to be making an effort to give an accurate, coherent statement to law enforcement officers. It's not the time. And it's definitely not the time to be making an effort to protect your own rights. And that's why we're going to go over some advice right now. And if you leave here with nothing else from me, I need every single one of us in this room to remember what we're about to say. If we're involved in a critical incident, we're going to do 2 things. Lawyer up and shut up. Can everybody say that with me one time? It's really that important. Let's give this a shot. Come on. Lawyer up and shut up. You guys actually sound pretty good. You know, here's what it comes down to. Every single one of us has rights under the Constitution. We got a constitutional right to silence. We got a constitutional right to an attorney. And I strongly advise that you use each of those to your advantage. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Every once in a while, I'll have somebody raise their hand in the back and they'll tell me, Mike, lawyer up and shut up, that's great and all, but I don't think you get it. Because I'm one of the good guys. I'm one of the good guys and I just want to cooperate. And if I invoke my right to silence, if I ask to speak with an attorney, well, then I'm just going to look like I'm guilty right away. I'm going to look like I got something to hide. Any of us sort of instinctively feel that way? Don't be shy. Any of us instinctively feel that way? You, sir, all right. I didn't know you before this. This isn't planned. You're not a plant in the audience or anything. Is that correct? All right. So I'm going to take a guess about you. And I need you to do me a favor. Since I'm completely guessing, if I happen to be wrong, I want you to just call me out, correct me in front of everybody, embarrass me in front of all these people, all right? But I'm going to take the guess that you don't have too much up-close and personal negative exposure to the criminal justice system. And what I mean by that is I'm going to take the guess that you're not used to having handcuffs slapped on you and thrown in the back of a car. Would that be correct? Oh, my goodness. Maybe I called on the wrong guy, all right? I'm going to take the guess that you're a law-abiding citizen. Would that be correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right, attaboy. Spoken like a true lawyer, right? But I tell people, dealing in criminal defense, I've had to deal with some hardened criminals over the years. I think we agree that that's not you. I've dealt with some career criminals. You know, court appointments, things of that nature, you don't get to pick your clients. I've had to deal with some pretty bad dudes. And you want to know something about career criminals? 10 times out of 10, these guys know to lawyer up and shut up. Now, why do we think that is, sir? It's not their first rodeo. They've been there, done that, got the t-shirt on the way out, am I right? So sometimes it's only natural for us law-abiding citizens who don't have that exposure to instinctively feel that way. It could be perfectly natural, but we got to get away from it because it's a bunch of nonsense. It's a bunch of nonsense. They'll have us believe that our constitutional rights are only for the criminals, that they're only for the people who are guilty. They're not. They're for the law-abiding citizens like you and I, just as much as they are for anybody else. So we've got to use them. Because you know who I've seen end up looking like they're guilty? I'll tell you. It's those folks who make that statement under the stress of the circumstances while their body's undergoing all those physiological effects, because they end up flushing any justification they may have straight down the drain. And inevitably, they end up giving an inaccurate description of what just happened. Those are the folks who I've seen end up looking like they're guilty. Now, like I mentioned earlier, with U.S. Law Shield, we work very closely with law enforcement officers, retired law enforcement officers, as our chief law enforcement trainers. And I want to tell you something. Generally speaking, when a law enforcement officer is involved in a critical incident, they get a period of time, typically 72 hours, before they have to make a statement. How many of us knew that? Many of them get 72 hours. In Pennsylvania, they've also got to get 2 consecutive nights' sleep. So through that very policy, through these very policies, if nothing else, the law enforcement officers are recognizing for their own well-being that right after a critical incident is not the time to be making an effort to give an accurate, coherent statement. They recognize it for themselves, folks. And what I say is if it's good for them, it's good for us. Am I right?
Yes.
So if we're involved in a critical incident, we're going to do those 2 things. What are they?
Lawyer up and shut up.
Did I put half of you to sleep already so far? You think we get some coffee in the back there? One more time.
Lawyer up and shut
All
up.
right, you sound great. Lawyer up and shut up, incredibly important. That's why I always get that out of the way first. But now that we've got that out of the way, I want to talk a little bit about when New Jersey law justifies the use of deadly force. When is it justified? So under New Jersey law, deadly force is justified when you have a reasonable belief that deadly force is immediately necessary to protect yourself against death or substantial bodily harm. Immediately necessary to protect yourself against death or substantial bodily harm. Now, when we're talking about substantial bodily harm, this is serious stuff. We're typically talking about mangling, disfigurement, permanent physical impairment, blindness, things of that nature. It's got to be pretty severe. Now, in Pennsylvania, it's death, serious bodily injury, kidnapping, or rape. They throw in kidnapping over there, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with the statistics, but when an aggressor relocates a victim, the chances of homicide go through the roof. Statistically speaking, when a victim's relocated, that victim will be dead. But in New Jersey, we've got death and substantial bodily harm. The law does also include aggravated assault inside that serious bodily harm, that substantial bodily harm. So for the purposes of the discussion, we're going to talk about death, substantial bodily harm, and rape. All right? So I want to try something out this afternoon. I need everybody here to repeat after me. You think we can do that? Easy enough. Repeat after me. Death.
Death.
Substantial bodily harm.
Substantial bodily harm.
Rape.
Rape.
All right. I hope that's the first time you shouted those 3 words out loud with a group of people. I'm just saying. Because if not, I got some serious questions about where you've been hanging out lately, I'll be honest with you. But death, substantial bodily harm, and rape. And there are 2 key components to the deadly force standard that I want to dissect a little bit. I want to talk about how they're evaluated and how they come into play. So first we said that deadly force has to be immediately necessary. You have to have a reasonable belief that deadly force is immediately necessary to prevent one of those things. It's got to be immediately necessary to protect yourself against death, substantially bodily harm, and for the purposes of this discussion, rape. So when we're talking about immediately necessary, we've got to be faced with a threat that's imminent. They sometimes call this the imminence requirement. Now I've got to ask, anybody with us have another good word for imminent? Because I'll be honest, I don't usually walk down the street with my pals tossing the word imminent around. We got another good word for imminent, anybody? Immediate? Excellent. What else? I had a guy one night raise his hand and say, right freaking now. What do we think about that? He's either from Brooklyn or Jersey, am I right? I love that one. It doesn't get much better than that. What else? You folks will appreciate this one. We were over at the Hilton in Allentown, Pennsylvania, over in the Lehigh Valley a couple of years back. We had a packed house, 70 people. It was maxed out, standing room only. And this one guy showed up. He didn't live